we talk about the best combat units in World War II, you may be thinking of the strategy and tactics that made them effective in battle. As for me, the crucially important factor in war is certainly strategy. In today's sponsor, the epic mobile game Lords Mobile, you can experience real-time war and practice your perfect strategies. Moreover, many people have joined to win the massive giveaway of $6,000 cash from Lords Mobile. Lords Mobile is the perfect game to kill your boredom, no matter where you are or what you're doing, while waiting in a queue, in the subway, the bathroom, or when you just want to chill for a few minutes, you can play Lords Mobile. In this game, you can do whatever you want. Be mischievous, capture and execute your enemy, or just enjoy upgrading your fantastic heroes, buildings, and technology. This game is not only about brutal fights. You can also make friends and build your kingdom together. There's a guild supporting you for every war you participate in, and the guild members can be your friends. They can keep you company by chit-chatting, battling, and farming while supporting you as you conquer the kingdom. Here comes the most important part, your chance to win the $6,000 cash giveaway. Click the link in the description below to download and play the game for free. Increase your might by building your kingdom, leveling up, and completing quests. $1,000 cash each will be awarded to the top 3 might players at the end of the event period, and tons of lucky winners will be picked out to win $500 cash each. $350 of Lords Mobile gift packs will be automatically offered to all participants after downloading the game. Download Lords Mobile from the link in the description for free now to win.
What was the most decorated U.S. combat unit in World War II? During World War II, the United States Army fought bravely on theaters across the entire world. For the gallantry shown in defeating the Axis powers, American soldiers received at least 1 million Purple Hearts. There was one unit, however, that stands out as the most decorated during World War II. It was the 442nd Infantry Regiment, with more than 15,000 awards and decorations. What's curious about this unit is that it consisted entirely of American volunteers of Japanese origin. Almost all Japanese Americans who fought in the U.S. Army during World War II were the so-called Nisei, or the second generation. They were the children of Japanese-born immigrants in the United States. Most of them lived on the American West Coast and Hawaiian Islands. When America entered the war at the end of 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, West Coast Nisei and their families were forcibly interned by the proclamation of the notorious Executive Order 9066. Under this order, American residents with foreign enemy ancestry could be placed under surveillance, detained, and even relocated by military fiat. Almost 120,000 Americans of Japanese origins were put in 10 relocation centers, since the government categorized them as potential enemies, afraid of sabotage and spying. The situation was completely different in Hawaii, where there was no internment of Japanese Americans except important leaders. This was because Japanese Americans made up more than 1/3 of the entire archipelago population. However, martial law was introduced in the Hawaiian Islands. The Kibe were singled out for particularly harsh treatment. These were Japanese American citizens born in the United States who spent time for education or other purposes in Japan and then returned to live in Hawaii. Japanese Americans in Hawaii were allowed to remain in service of the Hawaii National Guard. However, members of the Hawaii National Guard were temporarily disarmed, and local ROTC students and cadets were dismissed from service. These former students and cadets formed a civilian aid group, the Varsity Victory Volunteers, or VVV, which provided the physical labor needed for the massive construction of U.S. military bases in the Pacific. It was from these men that the Hawaiian Provisional Battalion was formed. The Hawaiian Provisional Battalion was also formed from Japanese Americans from the Hawaii National Guard. This unit was a forerunner of the famous one-puka-puka, the 100th Infantry Battalion. In early 1943, in spite of strong opposition, the government decided to call Japanese Americans to colors and to form a special combat team. By making such a decision, the government wanted to show that all citizens were equal in their rights and duties, and that Japanese Americans were as loyal as any other American. As well as this, inclusion of Japanese Americans in service was a counter-propaganda maneuver against the Imperial Japanese claims that America was fighting a race war in the Far East. Even though it was initially planned to have a higher engagement of volunteers from mainland citizens, their patriotic enthusiasm was hindered by the internment policy. The number of potential volunteers, therefore, was much higher in Hawaii. The initial plan to engage 3,000 volunteers from the mainland and 1,500 from Hawaii ultimately resulted with 10,000 volunteers from Hawaii and 1,182 from the mainland. As devised by the government, these men would only fight in the European theater of war. It seemed that the loyalty of the Nisei soldiers was not as indisputable as the government claimed. The order forming the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, issued on January 22, 1943, defined that all soldiers must be American citizens of Japanese ancestry residing in the United States since birth. Field-grade officers, on the other hand, were to be white American citizens. Other officer types were allowed to be of Japanese origin. The 442nd Regimental Combat Group was activated in Camp Shelby, Mississippi on February 1, 1943. The first commanding officer of the group was Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Pence. The 442nd went through basic training at Camp Shelby, the same camp where the 100th Infantry Battalion was deployed. These two units spent some time in the camp together until August 1943, when the 100th was deployed to Italy. The 442nd continued its training until the end of the year. After that, group units were sent to field maneuvers, where they showed excellent performance. During all that time, the 442nd was sending replacements to the 100th from their own 1st Battalion. When the time came for the 442nd to leave Europe, the 1st Battalion was almost completely depleted. On April 22nd, the 442nd Regimental Combat Group left Camp Shelby and went to Hampton Roads port of embarkation. The strength of the group was reduced by the depleted 1st Battalion, whose staff remained in Camp Shelby to train replacements. The 442nd arrived at the port of Naples on May 28, 1944. They were immediately attached to the 34th Division, while the 100th, one-puka-puka, was put under their command to replace the missing 1st Battalion. On August 10, 1944, the 100th was officially attached as a battalion to the 442nd Regimental Combat Group. They were to replace the missing 1st Battalion, but were allowed to retain their designation because of their previous combat history and the respect they had gained. By the time of the arrival of the 442nd, the 100th already built a respectable reputation. After their arrival to Italy in September 1943, they had been engaged in numerous battles. Their most famous engagement was in the Battle of Monte Cassino, where they earned the nickname of the Purple Heart Battalion. The bravery they showed on the slopes of Monte Cassino was dearly paid. Out of an initial 1,300 men, the 100th was reduced after Monte Cassino to just 521 soldiers. For their bravery in Monte Cassino, the unit was awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, later known as the Presidential Unit Citation. The first combat engagement for the 442nd and 100th took place on June 26, 1944, in the town of Belvedere, Italy. In their very first engagement, soldiers of the 442nd showed that they were to be a mighty force to contend with. In a coordinated attack, the 100th, 2nd, and 3rd Battalion attacked the well-defended town and managed to break the heavy German resistance, destroying the entire battalion there. In the next period, the unit continued the advance along the western coast of the Italian peninsula, all the way to the city of Livorno. On the hills above the city, the Germans made their last stand and defended this important point. This time, the 442nd Infantry Regiment fought in coordination with the 552nd Field Artillery Battalion, while the engineers of the 232nd Engineer Company were making sure to keep the supply roads accessible. For 3 days, the Germans resisted, but eventually lost the battle. By liberating Livorno, the Allies gained access to an important port for their future operations in Italy. After Livorno, the 442nd Combat Group went to the rear for a deserved rest. Their Italian tour of duty finished in September 1944, as they secured the Arno River as part of the drive against the Gothic Line. At the end of September, the entire combat group was moved to the Naples region, where on the 26th of September, they boarded Coast Guard transports and sailed to France. In Italy, men of the 442nd showed that they were right to be called to arms, but it was in France that they showed what they were truly made of. The entire combat team disembarked near Marseille and immediately went north to the front of the 7th Army near Epinal. After playing a significant role in the battle for Bruyères, the 442nd was relieved and went to Belmont for rest, which wouldn't last long. On October 27th, the entire combat team was called to the front line to relieve pressure on the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry, Texas Division. The 1st Battalion was assaulting enemy positions along the heavily wooded ridge only to find itself cut off. In the history of World War II, this unit was known as the Lost Texas Battalion. The 442nd rushed the same day to the ridge and launched an attack against the well-fortified enemy. The progress was very slow this day, mainly because the narrow terrain and thick forest allowed little maneuver. On top of that, they had to fight off the German counterattack, supported by a Mark IV tank and an armored car. The following day was not much different. The Germans were showing fierce resistance. Their artillery and mortar fire was pouring shell fire from above constantly. With shells exploding high in the trees, the 442nd were exposed to tree bursts from which they couldn't find protection. It was only during the night that the soldiers of the 442nd could take rest from the enemy fire, if it wasn't for the rain and very low temperatures that kept them awake. On October 29th, the 442nd continued their attack on the enemy. A platoon of tanks arrived as support. However, whatever approach they made, they were repelled by the Germans. At the moment when defeating the enemy seemed impossible, the word came that the Lost Battalion was in a desperate situation. If they were to be saved, someone had to do it immediately. At that point, Nisei soldiers of the 442nd decided to follow their motto, go for broke, waging everything on one roll of the dice. I and K companies of the 3rd Battalion fixed their bayonets and charged the impenetrable enemy positions, screaming Banzai! Completely surprised by this daring and bold move, the Germans started to flee their positions. A 2-day job was done by 2 Nisei companies in just 2 hours. The attack was followed by a maneuver of the 2nd Battalion, who managed to strike the Germans from their left flank. The 30th, 3rd, and 100th continued their advance, and by the afternoon managed to establish a connection with the Lost Battalion. Even though the Texans were saved, the battle for the ridge continued. When the 442nd was relieved on November 8th, they had been severely depleted. The average company strength was now only 35 men. The rest of the French campaign went on until March 1945, when the 442nd spent held positions in the Maritime Alps. It was a relatively quiet region on the French-Italian border near the Mediterranean Sea. There was action, but it was far from what the 442nd had suffered in earlier campaigns. On March 16th, French troops replaced the 442nd, who now left for Marseille to board the ships on their way back to Italy. The 552nd Field Artillery Battalion, however, was detached, as they were sent back to help other units, including the 7th Army. They would go on to be one of the units to liberate the Dachau camp.
Now, battle-hardened, the 442nd Regimental Combat Group arrived in early April in Italy and moved inland.
They were back in Pisa, which they liberated 8 months earlier. Their task was to attack the right flank of the German defense in the Po River Valley in order to ease the forthcoming offensive of the 5th Army. They would fight alongside the 92nd Infantry Division, the only segregated African-American active combat unit of the U.S. Army in Europe.
As well as this were British and French colonial troops and the
Brazilian Expeditionary Force,
which also had Japanese soldiers in its ranks.
In their distinctive manner, soldiers of the 442nd gave a significant contribution in clearing the Tuscan-Emilian Apennines region between La Spezia and Genoa. The German enemy were still resisting fiercely, but it was clear that their ultimate defeat was just a matter of days away. The old Italian city of Genoa fell on April 28th. From there, the Allies had an open road to Turin and Milan. On May 2nd, the last German units in Italy surrendered, and the war was over for the 442nd. When speaking of the 442nd Regimental Combat Group, their records also include operations of the 100th Battalion before it was attached to the 442nd. During the 20 months from September 1943 until May 1945, around 18,000 soldiers served in the unit.
They were awarded with more than 15,000 awards and decorations, including
21 Medals of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses,
1 Distinguished Service Medal,
588 Silver Star Medals, 22 Legion of Merit Medals,
15 Soldiers Medals,
5,200 Bronze Star Medals, 9,486 Purple Hearts, 36 Army Commendation Medals, 87 Division Commendations, 7 Presidential Unit Citations, 2 Meritorious Service Unit Commendations, and a Congressional Gold Medal awarded on November 2, 2011. This made the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit the most decorated of all U.S. Army units in World War II.